The Wizard of Oz, considered to be one of the greatest movies of all time. But maybe you haven't been on Earth in the last 85 years or so, or maybe just never got around to watching it. If so, come with me as we go down the yellow brick road and pay no attention to the dark tragedies that happened behind the curtain of this movie.
Are you sure about that?
Actually, no. Pay a lot of attention to those. We're going to talk about it. My name is Kyrie. This is Flights of Fantasy, a show where we look up different science fiction and fantasy movies and ask, what do they mean? And this is the dark side of The Wizard of Oz. We open on a sepia-colored Kansas, where a young Dorothy is constantly underestimated and talked over by her Auntie Em, who's too busy counting her chicks to listen to Dorothy's wild story about a mean old neighbor who wants to kill her dog. I'm going to be adding Jabberwocky to my casual vocabulary. In one of the most iconic songs in all of film history, Dorothy laments how she wished she could be in a better place and she wished that things would get better in the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow. I'm not even going to attempt to try to show that clip, for fear of angering the copyright gods. And I only fed them just last night, so it's really just better to leave them alone when we can. It's hard to imagine anyone other than Judy Garland as Dorothy. But the studio did consider Shirley Temple for a time. Unfortunately, Shirley Temple was just a bit too young for what they were looking for, and Judy Garland had the much better voice. Judy Garland was 16, 17 years old when she was filming The Wizard of Oz, but as we'll talk about later, it ended up costing her a lot. So mean neighbor Mrs. Gulch comes around and tells Dorothy that she has to give up her dog Toto so that way Mrs. Gulch can take it to the sheriff's office to be destroyed. Also, apparently Mrs. Gulch owns like half of the county, which, yeah, this is, I guess this is where Gremlins got Mrs. Deagle from. Old ladies hate dogs. After Toto escapes from Mrs. Gulch and runs home, Dorothy decides the best thing that she can do is run away. She tries to go off on her own, but she runs into a Professor Marvel who cold reads her in that kind of psychic way and convinces her to go back home. However, on her way back home, a tornado! Dorothy does make it home, but as soon as she does, she gets bonked on the head. By the time she wakes up, the whole house is spinning inside of a tornado, and she's looking at some weird stuff out the window. Eventually the house lands, and as Dorothy opens the door, we get a world of Technicolor as Dorothy steps into the land of Oz. Now, there's a common misconception that The Wizard of Oz was one of the first films to use color, which is not even close to being true, but it is perhaps one of the most iconic. A lady pops out of a bubble and introduces herself as Glinda, the Witch of the North, because as it turns out, Dorothy's house crushed the Wicked Witch of the East when it landed, and the residential Munchkins are thrilled to hear this. Dorothy is a national hero.
You've killed us so completely that we thank you very sweetly.
If you look closely right here, you'll see one of the Munchkin guards is falling asleep in the background. That's cute. I've been there, bud. I've been there. You know what's not so cute? Some tragic injustice, really. So Toto and her trainer were paid $125 a week, and the Munchkins were paid $50 a week. For reference, Dorothy made $500 a week, the Cowardly Lion made $2,500 a week, and both the Scarecrow and the Tin Man made $3,000 a week. Also, this movie was made just before the 1940s, where the public perception and general public treatment of little people was fucking terrible. Reading Judy Garland's interviews about the supposed rambunctious antics of the little people who played the Munchkins is just... Now, Judy Garland was only 16 when she filmed this movie, and I will say that filming this movie was absolute hell for her. That's not an excuse for how she dehumanized them, because, that's terrible. But, well, it's possible she had her own reasons for characterizing them the way that she did. It's been reported that when she was filming some of the scenes in Munchkinland, she was repeatedly groped and sexually harassed by some of the actors who played the Munchkins. Now, again, that's not an excuse to use dehumanizing language. And that's terrible. Also around this time, Judy Garland started being groped by a studio executive from MGM. Almost every time he would compliment her singing, he would grab her left breast because she sang from the heart and he just wanted to show her where her heart was.
What?
This kind of treatment would go on for years until Judy became an adult and said, "That's enough, we're not doing this anymore." Judy is quoted as having once said, "I often thought I was lucky that I didn't sing with another part of my anatomy." She was also repeatedly approached by many other studio executives who wanted to sleep with her.
What?
We'll get to more of how the studio treated Judy later, but for now, ding dong, the witch is dead. Doesn't really feel the same anymore, does it? The congratulations are cut short when the Wicked Witch of the West arrives, and she's looking for her sister's ruby slippers, which have now appeared on Dorothy's feet. So the paint that was used to achieve the Wicked Witch's green color was copper-based and toxic.
Wow.
This meant that the actress for the Wicked Witch, Margaret Hamilton, wasn't allowed to eat when she was on set. She had her meals through a straw, which... not a great way to live when you have to go through weeks of really long hour shoots. Furthermore, she also had to be thoroughly scrubbed of it after every shoot was done for the day. Because toxic. After the day's shoot, and even after shooting wrapped all together, her skin was stained green for some time. We'll come back to the witch's makeup, but know that she was not the only one who was absolutely miserable from makeup issues in this movie. Glinda convinces Dorothy not to give this Wicked Witch the ruby slippers because they must be powerful magic. And then she reminds the Wicked Witch that she has no power here and she should just go away. The Wicked Witch does so, but not before she threatens to get Dorothy and her little dog, too. It's how the witch leaves Munchkin Land that leads to our next tragedy. For this effect, Margaret Hamilton had to drop down a trapdoor into an understage area where the risk of her breaking her legs on the way down was so real that somebody's job during shooting was to stay down there just in case she broke her legs and they needed to get her medical care. But the first time that they shot this, it went off without a hit. But there's a saying in the movie business, one more take for safety. We want one more take to choose from just in case something happened in the background that we didn't notice until we started editing. They took a lunch break, and then they tried filming this one exit 4 more times, and something was going wrong every time. On the 5th take, the trapdoor didn't go down all the way. Margaret was not all the way down when the fire after the smoke started. She was set on fire. She suffered 2nd-degree burns to her face and a 3rd-degree burn to her hand. You remember that green makeup, right? Had to be scrubbed off every night because it's toxic, yeah? So Margaret Hamilton has just gotten burned pretty darn badly. And then she has to sit and wait as they use acetone or alcohol to scrub the green paint off of her burnt flesh before she can go to the hospital.
For so many years, I thought that there was something wrong with me, that I was the black sheep and I needed to change my personality. And after a lot of time and consideration, I realized who I was. I'm a piece of shit.
I can't even fathom that kind of pain. It took her 6 weeks to recover, and when she did end up going back to the set, they had to use gloves for her hands. She refused to do any more stunts that involved fire, and she ended up not suing because she knew how this business worked and knew if she sued the studio, rightfully so, that she wouldn't work again. The decision to not do any more stunts that had anything to do with fire turned out to be a very, very wise choice. So, Dorothy is told to follow the yellow brick road.
Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road.
And she does so when she meets a Scarecrow who decides to tag along to see the wizard because he wants a brain.
I would dance and be merry, life would be a ding-a-dairy if I only had a brain.
The prosthetics that were used for the Scarecrow were really uncomfortable, and the actor, Ray Bolger, actually had scarring on his face that looked like the burlap from the prosthetics for over a year after filming was done. He was actually originally slated to be the Tin Man, but he and that actor had switched roles, and that would turn out to be really, really fortunate for Ray Bolger, as we'll soon find out. In the forest, they run into some mean apple trees. some crabby apple trees, we might say, and they also run into a rusted-over Tin Woodsman.
Where do you want to be off first?
He said his mouth.
After they give him some oil, he decides he wants to go with them to see the wizard because he wants a heart.
Wait a minute. Who are you?
Our next tragedy is not about the Tin Man that you see on screen. The Tin Man we see on screen here is Jack Haley, but the originally casted Tin Man was Buddy Ebsen. Buddy Ebsen had noticed a shortness of breath with the beginning of shooting, but it wasn't until the 10th day that he couldn't breathe and he was in so much pain that he had to go to the hospital. You see, to achieve the silvery look of the Tin Man, they would start with a white clown paint base, and then they would dust on aluminum powder on top of it. That aluminum powder had coated the inside of Buddy's lungs. Like paint, it's been described as. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. He had to go inside of an iron lung, which is the machine that would breathe for you, and he almost died. And just for only 2 weeks, mind you. All the while, the studio executives are badgering his doctor, asking, hey, we're trying to make a movie here. When can he come back to work?
I'm a piece of
After 2 weeks of Buddy being in the hospital, Jack Haley was cast to replace him.
Wow.
And they also replaced the aluminum powder with more of a aluminum paste.
Wow.
And even then, that did cause a serious eye infection for Jack Haley. Fortunately, he was treated before it was life-threatening or anything, but that was still an issue. So yeah, face paint almost killed the Tin Man. So that's, oh my. Buddy Ebsen spent another 6 weeks recovering, but then went on to outlive all of the principal cast. There are still probably a couple of shots in the movie that have him in it because it's expensive to reshoot that kind of thing, and there are portions of the soundtrack where his voice is still on there. Fortunately, there is one dark rumor that we can put to rest at the moment. Allegedly, a crew member, one of the Munchkins, hung themselves on set, and you can see it in the background as Dorothy the Tin Man and Scarecrow go off to see the wizard. It's likely that this rumor started in like 1989 or on the 50th anniversary of the movie, and it is totally false. We now have the benefit of 1080p remasters at our disposal. It's not a body, it's a bird. It's just a big bird, like a crane or some kind of stork maybe. So upside, we can cross crew member took their own lives on set off the list of tragedies of The Wizard of Oz, although I don't know if it'll really make a dent in the overall list. So Dorothy and company are continuing to walk through the forest when they encounter a lion. Oh my!
Shame on you!
What did you do that for? I haven't any courage at all. I even scare myself.
As somebody who has previously struggled with self-confidence, I really connected with the Cowardly Lion learning how to be brave. Because being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Being brave means being scared but still following through with something anyway. And that's quite a good message to be sending. So apparently in the lion's introduction, Dorothy, Judy Garland, had a case of the giggles after the scene where the lion is gushing about his nose and asking if it's broken, because it's pretty funny. But she was, she had the giggles. After a couple of takes of this, the director pulls her aside and says, honey, this is serious. And then he slaps her in the face. She did the next take just fine. And then, upon realizing how awful and unprofessional it was for a grown man to be slapping a 16-year-old girl, the director went crew member to crew member, asking everyone, including Judy herself, to punch him in the face. She obviously didn't. Surprisingly, or maybe not, this wasn't even one of the worst things that happened to her at that studio. We'll get to more of that later. So yeah, the lion character was, he was always my favorite. I always connected to him. This just in from a few years ago. Because this movie was made before the days of synthetic fur, the suit for the lion was made from real lion pelts and weighed over 100 pounds. And because apparently lion pelts are distinctive in color and pattern, This meant the actor had to wear one suit for the entire shoot, on a set under blazing lights where the temperature could frequently exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit all day. The suit had to be put through an industrial drying bin so the sweat could be dried before production the next day.
Ew.
The lion suit sold for over $3 million in 2014, which, when you consider the finely aged layers of dried sweat, is really quite a bargain. So we've got our merry band of four off to see the wizard. And the Wicked Witch has been keeping an eye on them, so she decides to plant a sleeping spell in a field of poppies just outside Emerald City.
I can't run anymore. I'm so sleepy.
Toto, the lion, and Dorothy end up succumbing and falling asleep, but the Tin Man and the Scarecrow are not mammals and do not have lungs, but they are able to call for help. Fortunately, Glinda sends some happy, picturesque snow to wake them all up. You know, it was actually a comment on my Grinch video about this snowfall that inspired me to do this entire video. So let's talk about that snow and asbestos. So asbestos is a material that has lots of different uses. You'll most likely hear about it being in the ceilings of old buildings. Although in the 20s and 30s it was really cool. They would put it in a spray can, so that way you could put fake snow all over your tree. Because it looked a lot like fake snow and it really worked. One of the biggest dangers with asbestos is breathing it in, because it's linked to all kinds of fun cancers. If you watch television, like cable television, in the early 21st century, there's a good chance you saw this.
Attention! If you or a loved one was diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be entitled to financial compensation. Mesothelioma is a rare cancer linked to asbestos exposure.
So if you're a fan of buying antique Christmas decorations, please be careful. All of the snow in this beautiful poppy scene was asbestos. A lot of asbestos. There is no safe amount of asbestos that you should be exposed to. But, you know, I'm sure that the actors and the crew, who, unlike the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, very much have lungs, I'm sure that none of them breathed or accidentally ingested any of the particles of deadly asbestos. I'm sure nothing bad ever happened. So after being exposed to a storm of carcinogens, the gang makes it to Emerald City.
Well, bust my buttons! Why didn't you say that in the first place? That's a horse of a different color! Come on in!
I'm now going to be adding, well, bust my buttons to my casual vocabulary. Everyone in the group gets a nice makeover, spa day type situation when a dark warning from the Wicked Witch appears in the sky.
It's the witch. She's followed us here.
Surrender, Dorothy.
Dorothy.
Let's talk about the Wicked Witch again. So after her experience with being set on fire, Margaret Hamilton was not going to do another scene with fire. Her stunt double, Betty Danko, had already experienced a mishap on set where somebody had fallen through a stage door directly on her shoulders, where she had to go to a chiropractor on set, which was fortunately paid for by the studio. So when Betty Danko filmed for this scene, she was on top of a metal saddle, and underneath of that saddle was a pipe that would blow out the black smoke whenever she pressed a button. And on one of these takes, the pipe exploded. Her legs were severely injured and actually disfigured and scarred for the rest of her life. And guess what? That pipe was made from, or at least coated in, asbestos. For the entire film, after being a stunt double and being an extra, Betty Danko was paid in total $750, plus the $35 that she was paid after she rode the broomstick that disfigured her legs. Ironically, she continued her stuntwoman career until an accident happened, which was totally unrelated to stunts or filming. She was waiting for a bus when a car jumped a curb and hit her, and that was the end of her career. They're initially turned away from seeing the wizard, but are eventually let in after the doorman empathizes with Dorothy's tears. There, they're met with a very imposing floating giant head, who disses each of them individually. Afterward, he says that he'll grant their wishes if they can get him the broomstick of the Wicked Witch.
Bring me her broomstick, and
and I'll grant your request.
On the way to the Wicked Witch's castle, Dorothy is kidnapped by flying monkeys. The Wicked Witch, when she gets Dorothy, torments her, tells her she's only got to the end of this hourglass to live, and also torments her with visions of her Auntie M. The Tin Man, the Lion, and the Scarecrow sneak into the castle in disguise, and they manage to reach Dorothy in time. They try to escape, but then they're cornered by the Wicked Witch and her Winkie Guards. God, I love that. I love that they're called Winkie Guards. Gosh. The Wicked Witch decides it'll be the most fun if she forces Dorothy to watch as all of her friends and her dog die in front of her. And the Wicked Witch decides to start by setting the Scarecrow on fire. That broomstick is made from asbestos. So after her experience with fire in this movie, Margaret Hamilton was really nervous about setting the Scarecrow on fire. But she was assured, it's fine, there's no problem, don't worry about it. We've stuffed his costume with asbestos to make it less flammable. It's everywhere! So Dorothy throws a bucket of water at the Scarecrow, but it accidentally also hits the witch. She melts, and ding dong, the witch is dead. The Winkie Guards are thrilled about this too. They're like, yeah, you can have that broomstick, go for it. Dorothy and company return to the wizard and present her broomstick, but the great Wizard of Oz tries to blow them off. And then Toto pulls back the curtain to reveal the real Wizard of Oz.
Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
The great and powerful Oz was a sham, a fraud. He gives the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion a token representing the things that they want, but he doesn't actually give them anything. He decides he's going to take Dorothy back to Kansas in a big balloon. But at the last second, Toto jumps out of the balloon and Dorothy goes after him, and she's very upset because the wizard is going off and doesn't know how to make it go back, so looks like she's stuck in Oz. And her friends want her to stay in Oz. They want to be together with her. But then Glinda comes out of her bubble and informs Dorothy that she had the power to go back to Kansas at any time, but she had to figure it out for herself. Dorothy has a tearful goodbye with all of her new friends, and then she wakes up back in Kansas after clicking her heels. Oz was just a dream. No one believes her tales of Oz, and as far as we know, Mrs. Gulch is still going to be coming back for that dog, or else evict the whole family and their farm. There's no place like home.
And I'm not going to leave here ever, ever again. Because I love you all. And, oh, Auntie M, there's no place like home.
The end. The appeal of The Wizard of Oz is obvious. I mean, there's the creative and nice use of color, but beyond the technical aspects, I think everyone's been in a position in their lives where something just isn't going right, and we want someone to just fix it. You know, we need just this one thing, and then it'll be happily ever after.
My life has been simply unbearable.
Oh, well, it's all right now. The wizard will fix everything.
The producers allegedly thought that the audiences would be too sophisticated to accept it as just a straight up fantasy where she went to Oz, like that being a real place, which is why it was all a dream. Ooh. To a lot of people, this feels like a cop-out, because it is. If we think about the themes and Dorothy's character journey throughout the movie, the ending is a bit of a letdown, isn't it? I mean, in the beginning, all we see of Kansas is it's a place where Dorothy's frequently overlooked or ignored. And also an old lady wants to euthanize her dog. But throughout the entire movie, she says it to everybody. She just wants to go home. That is the one thing that'll make everything better. She just wants to go home.
Then I'm sure to get a brain, a heart,
A home.
The knife.
A big point of the movie is that you have everything you need inside of you already to find happiness. His gifts are tokens of recognition that ultimately don't amount to anything. It didn't grant them any of the traits. The Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion, they all found the traits that they were so desperate for already inside of themselves. And Dorothy, too, found a home in her new friends who listen to her and care about her. There's this famous thing called the hero's journey, which is where a guy, Joseph Campbell, laid out the 12 stages of the journey that a character in a successful story needs to go through. The different conflicts they encounter, how they change and grow, that kind of thing. Luke Skywalker is a textbook example of the hero's journey. Typically, in a hero's journey, they will have to go through trials, learn something, and if they return back home, they need to be changed. And if they decide to stay at home, they need to share what they've learned to their community for the better, to better everything that's there. By making Oz a dream, I mean, Dorothy seems to have a little bit more self-confidence, which is good. But when Glinda asks her what she's learned, and she responds with,
If I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with.
I can appreciate a theme that says, be grateful for what you have. I can and do. But I don't like that theme here. Dorothy isn't necessarily taking her family for granted, and her family as a whole isn't taking their status or wealth for granted. They're living on a farm owned by a mean woman who's threatening them with eviction, and it doesn't sound like they'd have any other options if that were to happen. Dorothy wants to live in a world where her options are not your dog is getting put down versus your family is being evicted. Those are terrible choices. In the beginning, Dorothy's wishing for a world without trouble, where she's listened to, a world with more color. It seems to me that she loves her family, and she loves the farmhands that work on her family's farm. So it feels weird to me to be ending the movie on a note like,
Dorothy, have you learned your lesson?
Oh, I have. I'll stay right where I am, and I'll be grateful for everything I've got. And I won't ever want for more. How does that help her with the mean neighbor who wants her dog dead? If we were to take this really literally, one could make the argument that Dorothy learned that if Toto runs up the farm and gets into trouble, that she shouldn't worry about him because she never really lost him to begin with. We're not going to take it literally because that's a very stupid argument, but one could make it. This isn't an awful way to end the movie by any means. It's not a terrible ending. But wouldn't it be a nice fantasy movie ending if Dorothy decides to stay in Oz, that is her new home? And maybe they can include something like she can visit Kansas with her ruby slippers, right? Or maybe she does go back to Kansas and she has this realization of, you know, I don't need to go to a different place. I have everything in me to make changes and find happiness where I am. I have that power inside of me. This movie was made toward the tail end of the Great Depression, which probably could be a good explanation for this scarcity is fine, appreciate that you have anything kind of mindset to the theme. I find myself just kind of feeling bummed out for Dorothy at the end. Like, I'm glad that she's happy, but will that happiness last after the novelty of, like, having made it back wears off? After Mrs. Gulch continues to threaten her family with eviction and threaten to kill her dog? When she's back to normal life? The movie really feels bittersweet in that respect. The biggest tragedy of The Wizard of Oz was the effect that it had on the life of Judy Garland. Judy entered the show business before child labor laws or, like, regular labor laws were a thing in general. When she was 10, her mom started putting her on uppers to get her through 72-hour shoot, and then would give her sleeping medication so she could go to sleep. Judy was signed to MGM when she was a preteen, and the studio executives would constantly call her fat and put her on diets. The shooting of The Wizard of Oz was somehow even worse. They wanted her to look younger. They wanted her to lose 10 pounds before shooting even started. And then when shooting did start, with long days of very physical work, her diet was black coffee, cigarettes, and sometimes broth. Damn! They also had her in a tight corset to constrict her breasts to make her look younger. So this movie effectively created an overwork, underfed teenage girl who was addicted to and relied on stimulants and depressants to get through a hellish shoot where she was constantly being told that she was never enough, where she was constantly hounded for whatever she ate, and that effectively opened a door where powerful studio executives and potentially other actors, depending on the reports, could sexually harass and abuse her and face absolutely no recourse or accountability. I'm not saying that this movie guaranteed that Judy's life would end the way that it did, deceased at age 47 from an accidental overdose after struggling with a lifetime of an eating disorder. But it would be really foolish if we didn't at least acknowledge that it laid the brickwork to that path. And if we go with what Dorothy learned from The Wizard of Oz, well, Judy Garland just should have been grateful for what she had. Shouldn't she? The Wizard of Oz is a beautiful movie, and one can easily see why it's considered one of the best movies of all time. But the tragedies and the production of it all, and Hollywood, and the life of Judy Garland, that more closely mirrors the great Wizard of Oz himself, where the reality of it is shocking, disappointing, and sad. But I want to hear from you. Do you view The Wizard of Oz differently? Which tragedy surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below, as well as any of your other thoughts. I might just make a video about it. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and if you like it, give it a like. Until next time, my name is Kyrie. This is Flights of Fantasy. I want you to live well and be safe out there. Bye. Fun fact, I made this skirt all by myself. This little suspender skirt, this moment. I did this.